Now, I want to go to this big development in Canberra today. The Prime Minister revealed that he'd received that report. It's been 4 years in the making. It began in 2016, looking at these allegations of war crimes by Australian SAS troops in Afghanistan. Now, the government has the report. They're going to release an edited version of that report to the public next week. But in the meantime, they've appointed a special prosecutor, a special investigator, to see whether a brief of evidence needs to be sent to federal prosecutors to lay charges. And next week we'll see that edited report, of course, as I mentioned. Let's have a look at what the Prime Minister warned us about today.
This will be difficult and hard news for Australians, I can assure you, to hear. Covering conduct over the course of what has been 3 governments over more than a decade.
Yes, indeed. As I said, that redacted or edited report will be made public next week, and there's going to be uncomfortable information in there for all Australians. Let's bring in now the Executive Director of the Australian Defence Association, Neil James. Thanks for joining us again, Neil. The first question I have is whether you believe this is the right action by the government. Is this the logical next step in this process to appoint a special investigator?
Yes, it is. I mean, the whole point about this is there needs to be accountability. The accountability processes have worked eventually. Well, they could have worked faster, particularly in the early days. And we're now in that stage where we know, or this report will probably tell us largely why and how it happened. And it now needs to be handed over to the Federal Police to work out in their re-interviewing of witnesses under caution who's responsible for it happening. And then it goes to the civil courts to award the appropriate decision on guilt or innocence and punishment if required.
Neil, a lot of this has been aired publicly through the media, and notwithstanding, we need to wait and see what a special prosecutor finds, what even any eventual court case lands on. Do we know enough already to know that there were episodes in Afghanistan that were problematic, that innocent people somehow or other were killed by Australian soldiers?
Yes, we do, and the Inspector General ADF's annual report for 18-19, which was released in February this year, made that point quite clearly, that there had been 54 incidents of unlawful killings and other serious nature occurrences that required a good sound looking. And one of the reasons why the Brereton report's taken 4 years is as more and more witnesses have come forward, they've had to follow more and more threads of evidence. And so Paul Brereton and his team have done a great job, and the whole country should thank them for doing it. But it unfortunately has taken a long time. But it has to be done. I mean, let's face it, our Defence Force is the Defence Force of a democracy ruled by law. They're not some armed rabble we send overseas to do what they like. And this is all part of holding them accountable if something does go wrong.
Absolutely. Now, you mentioned it's taken a long while already. You also mentioned that witnesses and others need to be re-interviewed. How long do you expect this process to take from here?
Well, Rhys Kershaw, the Federal Police Commissioner, said in a talk to the Press Club about 4 months ago it could take up to 10 years. And these are very complex matters. I mean, not only did a lot of it occur in a foreign country, a lot of it happened behind what is now enemy lines in a foreign country. So it's not as if it's going to be easy to interview local witnesses, if at all. And the complexity of it just means it's going to take a lot of time. Now, even when 2 bikies murder each other at a local airport, it still takes a few years sometimes. This is a much more complex and difficult situation for both the police and for the courts to handle. Now, I think a lot of the serious cases can probably be handled more quickly than that, but some of it might be, as the Federal Police Commissioner said, a decade or so.
And what do you think this will do in the meantime for public confidence in our armed forces?
Well, I think there'll be an initial degree of public shock, and then public confidence will probably return because they'll understand that this is the accountability process working. It shouldn't have happened in the first place, but the accountability processes have brought it to the stage where if criminal acts have occurred, and let's accept the fact that they have, then they'll be appropriately investigated and punished. When people talk about the reputation of the Special Forces or the reputation indeed of the entire ADF being tarnished, it's actually the wrong question. If we hadn't have done this and we had have just let our Defence Force get away with this, literally blue murder, imagine how much Australia and the Defence Force and its Special Forces would have been tarnished then. So everyone's just got to ride the embarrassment and the discomfort of this until we're through it at the other end. But at the end of the day, we're duly holding our Defence Force accountable, as we should be, as a law-abiding democracy.
Indeed, just imagine how relatively few countries around the world would hold their defence forces accountable in this way. And that brings me to, I suppose, the morale of our defence forces. Neil, are you worried that this will damage the morale within the ADF? And do you think that already it's shown that there needs to be a change in culture?
Well, a lot of the change in culture required has already started to occur. I mean, people haven't been sitting around waiting for the Brereton report to be finished, but obviously it will make some recommendations that'll have to be considered higher up the food chain by Cabinet, for example. The whole point about the morale of the ADF is, again, to look at it from the other point of view. Imagine the morale of the ADF if people in the Special Forces had have committed war crimes and got away with it. That wouldn't have been good for their morale either. And because of the time frame in which this occurred, even within the Special Forces, there's been a considerable rotation of personnel since that era. I mean, the area under investigation actually ended 7 years ago. And the ADF being a young person's industry, you know, people keep coming through it. It would be a lot worse, the morale would be a lot worse, and we'd have a lot bigger problem if we hadn't have handled this in the way we have. The only tragedy is it's taken so long, and even then, in most cases, apart from the early days when you've got to ask why people didn't find out about this earlier, it's taken as long as it's needed to take to actually help fix the problem and make sure it doesn't happen again.
Neil, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Chris.
Neil James there with the Australian Defence Association. I've got to say, most Australians, we support our ADF, and we also know that people are innocent until proven guilty under our system, as it should be. And it is, as Neil says, speaks volumes about our country and our armed forces that we go through this process, and we'll do it fairly and squarely. Justice will be served, but in the meantime, we continue to salute all those who risk their lives every day in the service of their nation.